Project Lawful aka Planecrash by Arwayne aka Eliezer Yudkowsky and Lintamande.
Safeguards against this ever happening again definitely need to exist, but if they can be negotiated without Pharasma, say among the other gods, then that's preferable to making them part of the Pharasma ultimatum. If future disasters are sufficiently unlikely, then creation shouldn't be destroyed just because its laws don't prohibit them. After all, Dathilan's laws don't prohibit it either. She's hoping they can negotiate around what sufficiently unlikely means. For one thing, she thinks Pharasma wouldn't actually create another hell and put Zon-Kuthon in charge of it. That would be a change on a scale that hasn't happened and might not even be possible, and that would serve the interests of no existing non-Zon-Kuthon gods and not be consistent with what Pharasma is known to care about. Perhaps Iomide or Arakura can give better estimates of its plausibility, but it'd be good to know how much implausibility is sufficient for Keltham.
Let him be considered an alien wandering by who sees a lot of matter in an unpleasant state, that can with some work be converted to a more pleasant state of non-existence. He's already put in some work to destroy the universe, and made some serious sacrifices about that. Then, after all that work, some other alien steps in and requests his indulgence to instead transform reality into a different end state, which that alien likes better than non-existence. He's not especially interested in calculating the exact least pleasant, most miserable state he considers better than non-existence, so that other alien can make him an exact minimum offer that gives him a near zero tiny fraction of the gains from coordination. If they're going to be revising creation anyways, how about if Pharasma comes up with a decent offer that doesn't resemble a hellhole so much anymore, and gets something that she herself considers comfortably better than non-existence, a state that neither of the two of them consider really icky and unpleasant. And everybody lives happily ever after, except for Zon-Kuthon, who ought to be turned back into Dubral anyways.
Because that involves him being willing to destroy some universes that don't have hell and have an incredibly low probability of ever having hell. And he shouldn't be willing to do that because it's an awful thing to do to people without even hell as justification. She can feel herself having to stamp on the impulse to get emotional again. But it's that answer, rather than the original plan, that is why she hates Keltham and wants to preemptively cryopreserve Dath-Ilan, the fact that he is willing to destroy the world if it is offered the end of hell. It is that which feels to her like a mad, monstrous, incomprehensible blankness, like murder for its own sake.
The fact that Carissa feels that way might get him to accept an offer of 4 in this ultimatum game, but not an offer of 0.01.
If Pharasma says, "Well, I can declare that the lawful authority over hell is Carissa, and I predict with very high confidence that I won't change who is the lawful authority over hell again in the next billion years, but nothing else you want is the kind of thing I really do as an entity," then Keltham should not consider it accepting an offer of 0.01, to bring hope and comfort and healing to every single person in hell and never have it again, and have everyone else in the universe go on with their good and wonderful lives. And if Pharasma says, well, I can declare that the lawful authority over hell is Carissa, and I predict with very high confidence that I won't change who is the lawful authority over hell again in the next billion years, and the other things are also things I could do, but I won't, because I don't want to. And Keltham murders every single person in the universe over that. He can't hide behind hell if he does that. He wouldn't be doing that because of hell. He would be killing trillions of people and sending at least some of them to hell because some of greater reality is bad, because he personally doesn't like the deal he got. She doesn't have a purer definition of what evil is than destroying a universe in which trillions of people live and none are in hell, because you feel that this universe doesn't give you a big enough share of the benefits of it existing.
No matter how high the stakes are, if you're willing to accept tiny shares of gains from trade, you won't get offered any other deals. That logic doesn't change when the stakes go up.
It seems to her that Keltham is not just rejecting the trade Pharasma offers him, of living in her universe as not worth it to him, which he may totally do if he likes, but is also going around smashing every trade Pharasma has offered every other person, which they ought to have the right to accept or reject on their own, and rejecting all those trades on behalf of all those people.
If putting Carissa in command of Hell is change enough that Golarion and every other planet in its plane, and every plane in the rest of creation, can with that much of a boost see higher technology and greater cooperation spread from star to star, until people here are no longer living squalid lives where half their children end up in the boneyard, that then indeed would be enough. That would be a fair chunk of trade gain. It wouldn't be the minimum quality of life and maximum misery that got him to be almost indifferent toward this reality's destruction. Similarly, if universal education got to the point where everybody could actually understand the choice made in deciding to leave creation for greater reality, and it was easy for them to skip the afterlife system if they wanted, he would be okay with that. But that sounds like civilization rising to great enough heights that it'd be fine regardless. Even a mildly below-average Dath Ilani might have a hard time grasping greater reality shit. It sounds like a stronger demand to make of Pharasma than just cleaning up creation's regular mess. Else, if putting Carissa in charge of Hell is change enough that Abaddon can be subdued, and the nearby surface layers of the Abyss subdued, once Heaven and Hell are fighting there side by side, if cooperation between Heaven and Hell is enough divine agreement that heroes can stride from plane to plane and smash the slave pits and torture chambers, until rulers and parliaments learn what worst of human behavior will earn extraplanar missions of disruption. Then he might be persuadable to consider accepting a world where people live in squalor for a few decades and go to a moderately pleasant afterlife for a few millennia or eons until creation reaches its natural endpoint and those people end up somewhere properly transhumanist where they can grow up for real, so long as they're not in agony. It would be a poor meaning to Carissa's life, he does think, if creation could have become something greater and more exalted than that. But he, for love of Carissa, did abide by her last plea to accept less. Does she ask of him to accept creation's stagnation in preference to its non-existence, for fear that Pharasma won't be willing to give more? It seems sad to him, for creation has the potential to be so much more than a breeding ground for souls in a handful of moderately pleasurable afterlives. He's not sure he'll agree, if Carissa's last request of him is that he permit creation to wallow in mediocrity and never become itself forever, as that pleases Pharasma. Not even as her last request. But she could ask, and perhaps he would accede, and then Pharasma would not be likely to offer any more.
If Keltham's demands of Pharasma are more and farther outside the domains in which Pharasma is accustomed to functioning, such as who she names the lawful ruler of Hell, then it is likelier that the universe will be destroyed and all within it lost. It is also likelier that there will be good things it will be much harder, perhaps impossible for creation to attain. But it is one thing to destroy a universe because it is bad, because there are those in it who cry out to die and cannot, and another thing entirely to destroy a universe because it is good, but there are goods it does not possess. It would be a fine and joyous and great meaning to Carissa's life if what she does is convince Kelthams not to annihilate any universes that do not have hell in them, to save all the trillions of people in all of those universes, and then to devote her eternity to building the greatest and best thing that can be built within creation, which will, she thinks, be pretty great. It doesn't seem sad to her because heaven doesn't seem sad to her, and Elysium doesn't seem sad to her, and Nirvana doesn't seem sad to her, and of course if she's in charge, she bets she can do even better. What seems sad to her is for all that all those places are or could have been to be lost forever. She is skeptical, in the end, that Pharasma can change the fundamental nature of everything about creation, in a way that she is not skeptical that Pharasma can change who is in charge of those afterlives that acknowledge Pharasma's authority to decide that. She thinks it's quite unlikely, and that demanding it of Pharasma almost definitely means everything is destroyed forever. Reasoning with trope logic, she thinks this might be the thing she is here to say to Keltham, the thing all the careful maneuvering was about. Not that a universe with hell in it is worth existing, because she was never going to convince him of that, but that a universe without hell in it is worth existing. Everyone in it can of course be told about greater reality and destroy themselves if they want to take their chances with it. She predicts that they overwhelmingly won't.
There should have been more mortal-born gods in this world than Irori, if Irori was possible at all, and it is suspicious to him that neither Nex nor Geb tried to attain divinity. There should have been trade between stars, if the outer planes are connected to all of them, if spells like interplanetary teleport are a thing. Galarian should have attained higher technology earlier, when +6 intelligence headbands are a thing here. The steam engine should not have needed to wait on the shattering of prophecy. If Pharasma can't directly help mortals, not even by giving her priests a contraception spell that some other god designed, then so be it. He hadn't meant to demand impossibilities of her, if impossibilities they are, as his minimum gain from trade. But he strongly suspects that there are measures set in place to prevent mortals from rising, to prohibit mortals from developing into gods, even if they naturally would, to prohibit trade between stars and planes. And whether those measures were born of pacts between ancient gods, or laid down by Pharasma, he had meant to demand, whether of Pharasma or of those ancient gods, that mortals be permitted to rise according to whatever fire is in them, and not be pressed down. He's not, by his own nature, inclined to tolerate a reserve where mortals are kept as livestock, and not for their own good either, even if those livestock are just ordinarily miserable, rather than in agony.
Oh, Carissa's definitely planning on building civilization, if any of Galarian survives to build it on, and they can send some arcs out for other worlds, if, as looks likely, Galarian doesn't. It's why she was initially prioritizing Galarian in her planning, the part which wasn't about partiality to her homeworld. She thinks that the place where prophecy is broken is the place where they should be most sure they can build civilization, whether Pharasma approves or not. Thinking something isn't worth destroying the universe to achieve doesn't mean thinking it isn't very important, or worth making many, many other costly sacrifices to attain. They could go grab some people in Axis and in Heaven and in Elysium and Nirvana and explain greater reality to them and see what they think. Carissa predicts that they will largely not consider themselves livestock and will be generally very happy about their lives and long-term trajectories, and will likely prefer to keep existing, and she will rethink some things if that turns out false. She'd be really surprised if you can't tell people about greater reality in the afterlives, even if you can't tell them while they're mortals. It's not that she doesn't think that everyone who wants to become a god should have the chance to rise that way. She absolutely thinks that. She means her hell to be a place where everyone becomes the greatest thing that they can be. She just thinks, and she suspects that Keltham too, if he's studied the question, will think, that a universe where everyone just goes to nice afterlives and it's rare for them to become a god is better than that universe not existing. She also thinks Keltham will think that at least enough of greater reality is nasty that he'd be sending some unlucky share of them to hell so that some others of them could become gods, which is a trade that doesn't seem very Kelthamish.
They can plausibly grab some lawful good and lawful neutral petitioners who definitely abide by a secrecy oath, and tell them about what he suspects might be much better lives and enhancements available in greater reality beyond Pharasma's slum. He suspects petitioners won't be allowed to offer specific comparison to actual afterlife conditions when talking to mortals, but he could ask the petitioners to assume hypothetical greater realities and the basic isekai hypothesis and ask them if they'd want to leave together with their families, and if so, the maximum tiny fraction of themselves that could end up somewhere worse than hell before they'd switch decisions back. They can put that on the experiment list. But if it turns out that almost nobody gets to be a god because of a Chikek, who he's planning to kill, obviously, but suppose that Pharasma says she's going to run right out and build another Akikek, or the ancient gods say they'll do that, so mortals don't get too uppity. Pharasma says that Carissa gets to take charge of hell, but forbids her from trying to build civilization, and demands indeed that he destroy Galarian. In an ordinary way, everyone there still gets afterlives, so that nowhere prophecy-breaking can exist where civilization could ever rise. What then? He, of his own accord, would probably tell Pharasma that he's fine dying together with her in a fire, in this case.
Carissa predicts that probably an overwhelming majority of everyone in creation would not prefer to be thrown into that fire, and she thinks that maybe this is a case where the Dathilani nature being quite different from the Galarian nature is important. Most Dathilani would perhaps be miserable if they ran out of all the things to do and read and learn at their current intelligence, and couldn't get smarter faster than they got bored. This is, she thinks, not how most people work. Most people, she thinks, though less confidently, don't even want to be gods. They want to go to heaven and live in peace and comfort, doing meaningful things surrounded by people who love them. And they're not wrong, she thinks. And they won't get bored, she thinks. Carissa are not like this, actually, not so easily satisfied, and you could imagine that those people are just failing to appreciate the depths of the difference between their lovely, perfect life and the better things they could grow into. But that seems like a different kind of claim about their incapacity to decide their own lives than claiming they don't sanely choose hell. The reason Carissa agrees they don't sanely choose hell is that when they do go to hell, they regret it. But if they go to heaven and don't regret it and don't wish they were gods, it seems like much more of a stretch to say there's some deep sense in which they should have been enhanced into something that would regret it and want to be a god.
He's not going to hide it. He is frankly concerned about the process that produces lantern archons like the one he met. Like, if that was a boneyard baby who went to heaven the moment they developed a discernible taste for helping other kids at age 4, maybe okay. If that was a normal Galarian peasant whose trip to heaven involved the equivalent of sudden intelligence-reducing brain surgery, one source claimed that petitioners absorbed the material of the plane they're on and didn't mention carefully developed safety protocols for delicate soul surgery. It's not totally impossible that he decides that heaven also has to go. He realizes that Carissa Seaver is probably not happy about this stance, and he hopes heaven turns out not to be full of horrifying brain surgery that makes people into stupid happy lantern archons that don't remember their past lives. But that whole lantern archon experience is something that, in retrospect, INT 18 Keltham was a giant flaming idiot for not getting worried over earlier. Even Cheliax's approved presentation of a lantern archon should have been an enormous flaming warning sign about afterlives. Sometimes he feels like he can't understand how Dothilan actually works, when everyone there is so stupid that past Keltham was one of their relatively smarter kids. He does, in fact, understand, because it's not that complicated in an absolute sense, but on an emotional level, it feels absurd, even if true that you could have a functional society where the average intelligence is only 17. Their wisdom in Galarian terms he estimates higher, but he doubts it's over 22 equivalent even in the specialized aspect of cognitive reflectivity. Even if there's some smarter people around, in retrospect it feels like a society like that should just fall apart.
Carissa is going to stick to her principled stance that if people like their lives and don't want to die, it is extremely wrong to kill them because you think that they shouldn't like their lives. It does mean a lot to her, though, that Keltham is considering how far he is willing to move in her direction on this. It is the first thing in a long time she's felt, hopeful and less lonely about. This whole thing. And if it turned out that Keltham and Dothilan aren't willing to destroy any worlds that don't have hell in them, then she thinks, for whatever it's worth, she wouldn't hate them and wouldn't want to preemptively cryopreserve them and wouldn't regard them as fundamentally basically a Carissa utility pessimizer under most circumstances. And she would be very, very happy to change her mind about that.
He appreciates that it's possible to move Carissa at all in her feelings. He was worried about that, and maybe he was wrong to ever be worried, but he was. The Lantern Archon scenario he's worried about is when people going in do not have a good picture in their minds of the soul surgery they're about to undergo, when they think they're fine with it happening to them. And then they get modified into something that is super happy and cheerful about being a Lantern Archon. It's not that he wants to destroy the Lantern Archon because he thinks it's wrong to be happy to be a Lantern Archon. It's that he would want to destroy heaven before it turned any more people into Lantern Archons.
Carissa isn't sure she wants to destroy heaven about that, but she agrees it'd be a really horrifying thing to do to people, among the most horrifying possible things. She would be really surprised and disappointed if the Iomede was doing that or letting people do that. It seems like the kind of thing where Carmen would say, "No, try again and come up with something that isn't horrifying." That said, the reason it is horrifying is that it's kind of like being murdered, so it doesn't really seem improved by murder.
Iomede isn't making these putative Lantern Archons on the hypothesis he's worried about. It's how Pharasma built afterlives to work, and Iomede can't do anything about it without Pharasma's permission. Maybe even Pharasma can't do anything about it, and then creation might have to go. To prevent future people from being possibly worse than murdered, in a way that it's harder and maybe impossible for rescuers elsewhere in greater reality to fix.
Carissa is confident that most petitioners who go to heaven do not show up there as Lantern Archons or Lantern Archon building material. They show up there as petitioners, and at some point some of them become outsiders, which seems pretty likely to be deliberate and voluntary, and in fact the kind of thing Iomedae or the other good gods could influence. Asmodeus, after all, has a hand in the making of his petitioners into outsiders. She agrees this is worth getting confirmation of. She is trying very hard not to evaluate Keltham off his willingness to destroy creation in this particularly unlikely hypothetical. Getting mad at him for unlikely hypotheticals in which he'd destroy creation is clearly just disincentivizing him thinking through with her where he actually draws the line. She will just not worry about the unlikely hypothetical where heaven's process of making outsiders is as involuntary as hell's.
It certainly is a very Carissa fact about Carissa that she seems in some sense more readily to be horrified and admit her horror among the most horrifying possible things, as she puts it, about a hypothetical process that seizes petitioners and turns them into cheerful lantern archons compared to, say, the process that makes devils. Perhaps this is an important natural attitude to have within your emotions for somebody who intends to become the new goddess of hell. A stab of agony that he sets aside. It's not as if he was planning himself to survive this event as himself, or as if there was any realistic prospect in the first place of getting Carissa back for himself, or even of her living happily ever after as herself.
Well, heaven would be making lantern archons stupider and weaker, and that's an awful thing to do, which Carissa will never do. Hurting people is fine. Weakening them is wrong. He can have her back. But only if he doesn't do this, and she understands why he's going instead to do this.
Would she truly rather get turned into a lantern archon, who'll, after that, almost never remember being Carissa and stay that way forever? Then end within creation and find herself elsewhere, undetectably to herself diminished in her reality, mostly in places that would let her become stronger and more herself and learn greater magic and mathematics. If those were her only two choices, and knowably so. He can't yet feel it, understand it empathically, this choice to exist in places that feel so much worse, only so that some measuring instrument outside of yourself can say, undetectably to you, that there is more reality fluid in you, only so that the little lantern archon you became forever will be more encounterable to other people.
She wouldn't choose the lantern archon over the other world, but she doesn't really buy the premise that there are a lot of people who will instantiate her elsewhere only if the lantern archon is destroyed, in which case it's better to have both the other world and the being a lantern archon. She doesn't care about what she'll in expectation experience next, compared to where she actually is and what all the hers are experiencing. Maybe she'd be the kind of brave and impressive lantern archon who grows up into something bigger. Maybe she wouldn't, and that'd be sad. But it wouldn't be so sad. She'd rather have the space of all existing Carissae just be narrower and smaller and have a big hole in that universe.
He's not saying it's an incoherent utility function. It's definitely a coherent utility function, but he's guessing it wouldn't be most people's utility function without specific prompting in that direction. He is concerned over whether she thinks it's fine to hurt the people in hell after she takes it over, even if they don't want that, so long as they were bad people in life and the hurting makes them stronger.
She does actually think it's fine, but she understands that many people she'd like to cooperate with disagree, so she won't do it, and she hopes that some of them will see that and correspondingly do less annihilating people. Or that's how she anticipates the god Carissa shaping up.
Many people would rather become lantern archons than be hurt more, even if it's because they're weak and afraid and too exhausted by the pain they've already felt in their lives. Yes, even genuinely evil people who've dealt hurt to others can feel that way. And he would destroy a universe to protect even them, the same way he'd destroy a universe to prevent them from being turned into lantern archons. There's a lot of gods he may be handing demands to at the end of this, and it may be that the god Carissa will be one of those.
She strongly suspects that preferring being a lantern archon or being annihilated to being hurt more is generally a state that makes it also bad for you to hurt you. In a hypothetical where someone felt that way, but actually hurting them would make them healthier and happier and stronger and more whole, she wouldn't think it was wrong. But as she said, she doesn't intend to do it, since a lot of other people feel strongly about that, and it's a pretty small share of cases. It doesn't really have anything to do with them being bad. Hell is and always has been for everyone. That was once a linchpin of her loyalty to it. A society which doesn't rely on people not being evil, rather than one that needs them to be evil.
She's done a better job of talking him into accepting some trades he would not otherwise have been inclined to than he would have expected, even taking into account how much of himself still loves her. There's an uncomfortable point to be raised here, which feels like a gotcha, or taking things back. If Abigail is not carrying his only child, modulo possibly also Jacinthe Subarax and Willa Shalira, whom Maritzel also disguised as, and there are many more others, which he does not currently model as being the case. On the evidence he has, it depends on how hard the story is out to force him into corners. Then if he waits to execute their plan, and it turns out he does have other irrevocably ensouled children, that on his current psychology affects what level of shit he's willing to accept from Pharasma. It's one thing to accept that INT-29, Carissa has more rightful guardianship than he of the other life forms in Galarian, that it's her place to defend their interests from his weird extra-universal morals and intuitions. He's got a lot of probability mass on the people here not actually being all that real anyways. He's not sure enough of it to leave them in hell, but he's not sure they do exist either. It's another thing entirely to let his own children grow up in a crapsack world, and maybe end up actually as real as himself in a sequel, within either set of possibilities.
That does strike Carissa as a strong argument for destroying Cheliax before his children might be ensouled, if they determine that those children exist and aren't ready to go ahead with the Ascension plan yet. It could perhaps be done without prompting the gods to reassess Keltham as a threat if, instead of wish wordings they need for the main plan, they use some lesser power out of Dath Ilan, or get some other countries to invade. If solutions in that genre are not available, the arcs that are meant to survive the destruction of Galarion should be equipped with the resources to resurrect the children and provide them a good life on the ark, and the Church of Iomedae equipped to sweep in, conquer Cheliax, and make it nice if it continues existing. But crucially, this is not a problem Pharasma is going to be able to solve. Pharasma probably hates the baby situation. Carissa has been reading up intensely on Pharasma and now infers it to be an ongoing source of annoyance to her because babies don't have enough traits to be sorted. If she had a way to fix the baby situation, she would have done it. Playing hardball with her about the babies won't achieve anything because the babies are a problem Pharasma wants solved, and which will be solved if the universe goes on existing through contraception and so on. They have to come up with a clever and sufficient plan for protecting all of Keltham's babies, which does not involve Pharasma at all. That's all there is to it.
He apologizes for his mental sloppiness in using Pharasma as a shorthand to refer to Pharasma plus the rest of the ancient gods, which he had modeled, high probability but not certainty, to form an effectual coalition with respect to creation. 6 intelligence headbands exist, yet industry only started picking up after Erodin's death and the shattering of prophecy. Interplanetary teleport exists, but there's no sign that worlds which can produce diamonds more cheaply than spell silver are trading diamonds for spell silver, with worlds that can produce spell silver relatively more cheaply. Axis, with very high probability, has knowledge they're not allowed to give to Galarion. If Abadoran theology is true, then Abadar has copies of Aslant tech manuals, but isn't allowed to sell those back even to the planet that created it. He infers massive, ongoing intervention by some divine coalition within Galarion and surrounding planets and planes, with macro goals being effectively pursued. He puts high probability that this potent intervener would be able of delivering some pretty major asks about Galarion if it wanted, even if Carissa is right that Pharasma can't do it herself. He himself puts more probability that Pharasma is just reluctant given inhumanly non-interventionist goals. But even if that's false, clearly something exists, some collective, that's able to satisfy goals like no industry advance to the point of diamond synthesis, anywhere that prophecy still holds. It is his strong guess that Pharasma plus the ancient gods have collectively the ability to decide that creation doesn't need to look like this. Decide that mortal industrialization is allowed, not just in Galarion, where it's too expensive to stop, but everywhere. Pharasma plus gods could turn the same efforts that they put into suppressing mortals, to shutting down the most horrible particular elements of creation, the Nidals and Zovaikanes, lest otherwise the world become something that his ascended self preferred to not exist, and would destroy. Or it's possible that even that much positive action from the divine coalition, potent intervener, wouldn't be required, as his thoughts covered before, that if the good gods didn't need to fight hell, and the gods stopped actively suppressing mortals, then that would be enough by itself to set creation predictably on a course to Pharasman civilization, as would be fine by him. If it is genuinely actually true that Pharasma and the ancient gods lack the power to, by action or inaction, let creation not be such a crapsack, then future him can consider then whether to destroy it. But he mostly strongly suspects that Pharasma plus the ancient gods have the power to steer the future somewhere else, which is not that.
Carissa's present theory is actually that there's more industrialization elsewhere in creation, that Golarion has historically been subject to more meddling because it has Rovagug in the middle of it, and industry, going off Dath Ilan, can give mortals the power to let him out. She doesn't know anything about whatever civilization sent the thing that crash-landed in Numeria, but Golarion doesn't have the capabilities to send things across the stars, and that civilization evidently did. She's not sure this matters to her very much either way. There are still lots of cool and valuable things happening on planets without industry.
There might have been an over-update on what past Keltham described as the difficulties of interstellar travel faced by Dath Ilan inside of non-magical physics, where you don't just have mortal Erodin doing interplanetary teleports all over. He'd guess that wasn't an industrial spaceship, just one magically hacked together, or a magically star-traveling life form from the Dark Tapestry, or some other draw from all other possibilities. Seeding diamonds out of hot 1% methane 99% hydrogen in a zero-gravity space-looped demiplane is much, much easier than interstellar travel the hard way, and nobody was selling synthetic diamonds to Efreet in the city of Brass before they got there. Unless the Efreet themselves, and not just Efreet trade goods, are partitioned by planet. And the Golarion trading Efreet can't buy wish diamonds for even their own use from Efreet, who trade with hypothetical industrialized planets. It's possible, but improbable, counter-evidence that adds to other counter-evidence. How does Carissa feel about demands that divinities at least stop actively hindering mortals from making their lives better? Does this feel like something she's terrified he can't get, will constitute asking for too much, and then creation ends?
She thinks he shouldn't say, "or I'll destroy the universe" about it. Or I and my allies won't do any positive-sum trades with you and will consider ourselves in a low-key state of war with you, is fine. That doesn't entail destroying the universe. Carissa will absolutely back him on withdrawing cooperative relations from gods that get in the way of mortals making their lives better. She'll back him on trying to assassinate them. Carissa agrees wholeheartedly that the gods could probably stop getting in mortals' way, and that getting the gods to stop getting in mortals' way should be the highest conceivable priority. But it is not acceptable to murder trillions of people because it was too hard to achieve, and so the means by which it is achieved cannot be threatening to murder trillions of people. They will simply have to pursue this incredibly important objective in some other fashion, once hell is destroyed. Mortals are creative, and prophecy hasn't been gone for long. She doesn't think the hindering will succeed for long, let alone for forever.
And if, from a godly angle, it looks to him like the hindering will succeed? If it looks like only Golarion alone will ever be free, unable to liberate anywhere else? Or if the ancient gods demand Golarion be destroyed as the price of other bargains? Those entities are kind of assholes, Carissa. These are eventualities to be considered. They obviously don't want mortals getting uppity, and if it turns out they believe they've got a plan for keeping mortals firmly down, should he disagree with them about that question of fact? If they don't have a plan like that, if Golarion survives, why wouldn't they demand some arrangement like the deliberate destruction of Golarion? Why would they not demand every last scrap that she was willing to concede if she persuaded him to concede it?
They haven't destroyed Golarion yet, despite prophecy being broken there, despite all the headache it has given them. Presumably because Rovagug is contained within. Destroying Golarion and letting Rovagug out would be, she thinks, a great victory for those gods who want to keep mortals down over those gods that don't, and it's not all of them. She doesn't think it's Abadar. Abadar kind of jumped at letting the mortals build civilization, even in the face of what he knows is some risk they'll use to destroy themselves. They can ask Arakura, actually. A bunch of her questions for Arakura relate to god alliances they can offer and join on Ascension. She just wants Keltham to, when he ascends, look around and see which gods he's allied with, and then be allied with them instead of trying to unilaterally wreck everything.
already part of the plan once he's legible to the lawful ones, and can do binding logical deals not to have info he provided be used against him. He'll have unfortunately needed to do a lot of grim work before then, on his best present plan, like destroying Absalom and releasing Rovagug, both as a distraction and to preemptively defang Asmodeus by placing him in a situation where he'll fight on the anti-Rovagug side. But if it were possible to just show the gods how it would go and have that be credible and move straight to the negotiated outcome, none of this would be happening inside reality at all.
She doesn't think she can get him to be sure that there's categorically nothing other than hell worth destroying the world over. But the system not being fair, fixing it other ways being extremely hard and uncertain, she thinks that actually, humanity would take that over a high risk of being destroyed, and anyone trying to act on behalf of the mortals inside Pharasma's system would remember that overwhelmingly, if not facing hell, mortals don't want to be annihilated, that when slaves they don't want to be annihilated, when prisoners they don't want to be annihilated, that the route ahead being hard and uncertain and unfair is not a problem they solve by dying about it.
From a godly standpoint, there'll just be a probability estimate, not the road ahead being hard and uncertain and unfair, just a probability of victory. If you don't like your thoughts and feelings collapsed into probability estimates, then don't become a keeper, and the same presumably applies to becoming a god. Suppose that the probability of fixing the system looks like, say, 0.01%, because the ancient gods will it not so, and they demand of him that he personally scour clean Golarion with antimatter in exchange of the end of hell. Does she bid him then concede?
Certainly it'd be absurd to destroy the universe rather than do it, what with how destroying the universe has all the downsides of doing it and then some. And if that's the price of ending hell, it's a price worth paying. Even she thinks so.
Depends on whether you think a god-corralled and herded subpopulation of the human race and the sapient kind, as that greater population exists across all the realities, is a positive or negative contribution to the whole. And it doesn't have to be the price of destroying hell. It could be something the ancient gods demand only because they're assholes, and Carissa is titanium bent on conceding them everything they ask. Why wouldn't they demand it, if he's predictably going to concede to every demand?
The proposal is that he not destroy any universes, which are pretty excellent. Carissa thinks that the universe, without hell in it, with no other changes, would be pretty excellent, and constitute mortals, not Keltham maybe, but normal mortals, having gotten a great deal relative to their alternative of not getting this life at all. She thinks that if you take hell out of the picture, mortals mostly live interesting and challenging lives, doing things that matter to them, around people who love them, and the ones who hate it could suicide without worrying about hell. And Carissa, when she catches them, can do whatever they want done for them, including sending them to greater reality if they want that. The difference between that and the universe not existing is much, much, much larger than the difference between that and a better universe. Theory related to this. Dathilani don't seem happier than Galarianites, and she suspects that some of that is them having bred themselves wrong. But the other obvious theory is that people are pretty much the same amount of happy under a really wide range of situations, and letting Golarion become like Dathilan in wealth levels would be only a small favor to the people in it. They could run a lottery if they wanted to test this. If you win, you get 10,000 GP, enough to never work again and live in luxury, and if you lose, you get fed to demons. Carissa predicts that basically no one will take this lottery, and the ones who do will be doing it to save sick children or resurrect damned loved ones, not for selfish reasons. And it's the lottery Keltham proposes entering for them as a collective.
He would want to explain about anthropic survival and greater reality, and he's not sure he can, even leaving aside the unshareable evidence from his own perspective of starting in Dathilan and ending up in Golarion. Carissa spoke of slaves choosing not to die. The vast majority of those slaves don't have the guarantee of Axis or Elysium if they died, especially if they suicided, as Pharasma defines to be the evil of murder. Another evil that isn't remotely bad, another way to end up in an evil afterlife without being a bad person. But perhaps Carissa is right as a matter of human variant psychology, that even a slave with the promise of Elysium would still not want to die. Would this be coherent reasoning? And not, for example, the result of natural selection against people who took afterlives seriously, who really believed in hell and didn't have kids, or who took heaven seriously and sacrificed themselves altruistically against demons. He remains skeptical about the proposition that clinging to an awful life is something that Galarianites would be selected to really coherently prefer, rather than them just being selected to not really anticipate the promised afterlife. Assuming, of course, that a slave with the promise of Elysium would not just want to go to Elysium like a sane person, further assuming that Elysium doesn't turn you into a cheerful, bright, glowing ball, which would be another excellent reason to want to stay alive, though miserable. Mostly that should be set aside for later experiment. It's the sort of disagreement they might be able to resolve by using detect thoughts on a volunteer at this intelligence level. But if the Golarian variant of humanity is bred not to really believe in hell or Elysium, it's probably also impossible for them to really emotionally believe in anything he says about greater reality. Even if they use 15 wishes and a +6 intelligence headband and an owl's wisdom to make the underlying arguments understandable. He supposes that they could find that somebody with that boost would suddenly say, "Oh, wait, what the ass was I thinking? Of course I'd rather go to Elysium than be a slave." And then they might be able to coherently process arguments about greater reality, but that experimental outcome would still undermine Carissa's point.
Carissa expects that, for the most part, for most people, there has never been any serious selection at all around ability to think or not think about afterlives, because the overwhelming majority of people are farmers who know only vague legends about the gods that may or may not cohere to anything in particular. Most people who have ever lived probably have no idea if hell is real, or if it's really very bad, or if Elysium turns them into a strange alien, or if they'd prefer either to non-existence. This is testable. They can go ask people in remote villages someplace. The thing Keltham is postulating, selection, where people who thought clearly about the world and realized they didn't want to live in it had fewer offspring, could only possibly have happened among a tiny segment of the population which had any confident knowledge about the afterlives, high-level spellcasters and people who get trustworthy information from them, and the ability to, based on that, control whether they had children, which most people can only do through lifelong celibacy. She does suspect that humans are selected against finding lifelong celibacy easy. Furthermore, coherent reasoning is useful for tons of other things that affect whether your children live to adulthood. Planning which crops to plant, how much seed corn to hold in reserve, how to interpret signs of a coming storm, how to decide when to flee and when to stand and fight. There is extremely strong selection in favor of coherent reasoning. Her best guess as to why everyone isn't ridiculously good at it is that there are some deep physical trade-offs. Regardless, she doesn't think this matters. The process by which people arrived at their current reasoning abilities and attitudes about the afterlives aren't relevant to her. The reasoning abilities are relevant and the attitudes, but not the process. And she doesn't care if they emotionally believe anything Keltham has to say. If they, in fact, told about greater reality and about the existing afterlives, want to go to the existing afterlives, then even if this is not what Keltham thinks they should want, or not what he thinks a different person with different abilities would want, it doesn't matter, because they are not Keltham's slave to dispose of as suits him. They should get the thing they actually want, not the thing that Keltham believes they would want if they were bred for or otherwise predisposed to greater coherence. It really and truly feels to Carissa like it is profound evil Keltham is describing here, to destroy someone's soul over your own conviction that, while they prefer heaven to the distribution of outcomes in greater reality you described to them, or reject the premise that experiential thread is what matters, if they were better at reasoning, they'd most likely want something else. She just doesn't think it's all right to do that to people, ever. She thinks you'd kind of have to lack some essential human sensibility that Dath Ilan perhaps bred out of its own population in order to want to.
There may have been effects on her moral cognitive reflexes for that she grew up in Chiliax, where every authority and every person who wants to overrule you for what they claim is your own good, in fact doesn't really care for you much. Or, insofar as they do care about you, is actively steering you against where you'd want to go if fully informed, i.e., trying to steer you into lawful evil. Someone who grew up that way might come out of that with a different moral outlook on parentalism than someone who grew up in Dath Ilan. Civilization's prediction markets are basically well calibrated. Governance has a functioning delegacy that puts non-assholes in charge and could immediately kick out any who turned asshole later. Dath Ilan is nonetheless very conservative about applying parentalism because it's understood that parentalism incurs long-term costs for short-term gains. When you prevent people from making their own mistakes, you also prevent people from learning from them. Well, of course that's also more of a long-term benefit in Dath Ilan, where people in societies actually do learn from mistakes. But if you don't guard the heavy machinery well enough, a kid can wander in and get killed, and then they can't learn from that. Or rather, the lesson comes in the future, but that's a little late. Dath Ilan has always staged its degree of parentalism, as measured by the difficulty of the competence tests you need to pass before doing something supposedly harmful, with the goal of giving the smaller minds, like kids, the chance to make their own mistakes, provided that those mistakes aren't going to cause severe, irrevocable damage. That is, civilization is heavily, but not massively conservative in the direction of more letting people make their own mistakes. Adults with learning disabilities who will never be able to pass the relevant competence test get stronger guardrails set around them because they can't learn from their mistakes, and so there's not as much long-term benefit to letting them hurt themselves. The fact that people in Golarion have probably been implicitly selected to instinctively distrust, hate, and resent authorities, in a world where authorities weren't in fact looking out for their best interests, well, mostly it strikes him as possibly reflecting a trope about unreasonably difficult thought experiments. What if an organism couldn't steer to avoid hurting themselves, couldn't think about the question intelligently, couldn't learn from experience either because the problem was one shot else die, or because they were too dumb to generalize the right lessons, and they'd been evolutionarily selected to disbelieve in the possibility of anyone else helping them steer, and to feel angry and awful if you tried to help them anyways. And there's an old fallback in overly difficult thought experiments like that one. Go back to what's actually true. People can tie themselves up in tangled knots of belief and trust and resentment of parentalism, but afterlives are just real. Cryonics is just real. The future is just a place, and so is greater reality. The core idea cutting through all Dath Ilan's arrangements is this: that when the test shows that you see reality clearly, you are said to be ready to navigate it yourself, even if society doesn't like your choices. The reason why kids are prevented from killing themselves generally, and true killing themselves especially, before they pass the respective competence tests to choose either, is not that civilization thinks it proper for parents to have different interests in children than children have in themselves. It is that civilization is reasonably certain that it does in fact know something that the kids don't know, and to be more meta-rational than the kids about which of them is more likely to know it. Namely, the value of information from staying alive longer, to see what unfolds. When prediction markets become sufficiently certain that somebody would say years later that they should have been allowed to suicide years earlier, that's an automatic license to do so, no matter how young you are at the time. He's sympathetic to the idea that 10 people in Golarion should be allowed to hurt themselves, maybe deal themselves lifelong crippling injuries that they can't afford to get healed, if they say to the likes of gods and 29 mortals, "Stay out of my business." Past Keltham fell on the individualistic side of civilization's moral balances. He wanted civilization to move more in the direction of people looking out for themselves, rather than looking out for others. You could make a strong case for letting 8-year-olds get themselves killed that way, once they're old enough not to make the wrong choices in the boneyard. In the long run, that provides the benefit of calibrating future generations to accept the right amount of advice. Conversely, if you prevent kids from killing themselves or force them to take advice, standard dysgenic mutational pressures may produce increasingly suicidal or intransigent kids. But he starts to worry when it comes to the question of letting people go to hell, or for that matter, having children in Cheliax if Cheliax stays the way it is. At that point, it starts to become proper for the government to step in and do something about it, at least if it's Dath Ilani governance, rather than Golarion royalty. That's a kind of mistake that smaller agents really can't recover from, and it's the proper job of larger agencies to guard them parentally until the smaller agents pass the relevant competence tests for having understood what they're getting into. Past Keltham thought in Dath Ilan that people ought to be more selfish, and wished that civilization were set up to work with more selfish people. But even he considered there to be an obvious caveat for having systems in place such that children could successfully grow up, and not just, get eaten by the first adult who talked them into signing a legal release allowing them to be eaten.
Carissa agrees that letting people go to hell is taking this principle too far. She thinks that the way you can tell it's taking the principle too far is that generally, once they're in hell, they don't want to be there anymore. But she doesn't think that applies to people choosing heaven over greater reality, assuming heaven doesn't mind edit them to like it once they're there. She doesn't think they'll later regret it, and if they do, they can in fact go try out greater reality at that point. And Keltham was just hypothesizing people who they told all of the facts known to them about greater reality. She thinks that at that point they know the facts and they choose heaven. It's a choice there's no justification for overriding them in. She agrees that the parentalism of Dath Ilan is much less bad than the same thing in Cheliax. But she observes all the same that if there were people in Dath Ilan who were miserable not to have more freedom, not to be allowed to go start their own civilization, to have had the crucial decisions about their childhood made for them, well, those people wouldn't have kids. And so Dath Ilan probably does have selection in the direction of being all right with lots and lots of parentalism.
In an absolute sense, yes, there's lots of parentalism in civilization, and decreasing it is an ongoing problem that lots of very serious people worry about, not least because they're explicitly worried about selection pressures for being okay with whatever level of paternalism is allowed to prevail. In Golarion, he observes a notable tendency for city governments and kingdoms to ban books that might lead people into heresy, and not offer those books for sale in ill-advised consumer goods stores to anyone who's old enough, or any child who passes a requisite competence test about it. In Golarion, once the city-level or national-level government, or maybe just a powerful local church, decides you're not allowed to buy a book, or a drug, or in some places a night with a sex worker, that's just the rule, and there's no exception for anyone. One could conceivably argue that Golarion's policy is really the same as Dath Ilan's policy. It's just that nobody in Golarion can pass those competence tests, so nobody in Golarion is allowed to go to an ill-advised consumer goods store, so they might as well not exist. However, it seems to him that the competence test of the individual ought to be calibrated to the competence of the government that wants to overrule them, and governments in Golarion couldn't pass those Dath Ilani competence tests either. People in Golarion are being selected to be okay with much greater levels of obnoxious interference in their lives, so far as he can tell. It's just that the claim of those governments to be acting on behalf of the individual, with all their meddling rules and prohibitions, is not even that believable. So it's not, at that point, selection pressure about being okay with real, actual parentalism from an entity that plausibly does have your best interests at heart. It's about submitting to a Golarion government that will otherwise torture or execute you. But this is getting off track from the key point, and the rule he knows for cases like that is to review the local stack trace. A couple of stack layers up, Carissa was putting forth the predicted but not confirmed observation evidence of an average slave prefers to stay alive and is predicted by me to want that even if they were guaranteed to go to Axis or Elysium. Is his paraphrase okay? He wants to check. As moral input into the question of how bad it is to prevent people from existing in a life that's hard or unfair. Carissa had also proposed an experiment about explaining to someone about greater reality and then offering them 10,000 kie in exchange for a 50% chance of being eaten by a demon under controlled conditions. Paraphrase, okay? As moral input into how bad of an individual choice violation would be involved in destroying creation. The problem from his perspective is that if an average slave doesn't choose Elysium, he's not clear on to what extent that implies a general problem with truly believing that Elysium is real, versus a strong coherent preference to stay in Golarion. Carissa then put forth a claim that it was morally imperative on him not to test whether an individual's preferences were coherent or their beliefs accurate, just obey their stated decisions. Paraphrase, okay? But in the moral system he knows, there's no obvious systematic way to put forth an absolute deontological rule like that, rather than a defeasible deontological pressure, without implying that 8-year-olds should be absolutely allowed to take truicidal actions that they don't know are truicidal, but that they say they want to do. Carissa replied that letting people go to hell is indeed too far, implying it's a deontological pressure rather than a deontological rule, and said that heaven versus greater reality should be up to the individual. He tentatively agrees with leaving heaven versus greater reality to the individual, if heaven isn't actually gotching people into lantern archons, but yeah, sure, that seems unlikely. What next step of argument from there?
If he agrees with leaving heaven versus greater reality to the individual, then they might just agree? Carissa doesn't think she is reasoning in deontological rules. She's not sure how those fit into Carissa values, and they may not at all. She's mostly just thinking in terms of civilizations. She'd want to preemptively cryo-preserve or not. She thinks that as much as she hates it, Keltham is at least maybe right about hell. And she's just scared that because Keltham doesn't think anyone else is reasoning clearly, he will make trade-offs between non-hell places and greater reality, which aren't, in fact, those they'd make.
Yay for apparent possible progress pending further discussion plus toward agreement then. But not to overpromise progress. He's worried for trope-based reasons that, after they have a few more days to mentally pursue this debate, they won't end up actually agreeing about the expected value of greater reality to people, versus any living standards higher than literally hell. In particular, he's worried for trope-based reasons that the real heart of the disagreement between himself and Carissa will turn out to be that past Keltham experienced his true death and continuation elsewhere, and now remembers apparently direct confirmation of isekai immortality being what Trudying people actually experience. That evidence centers on his self-observation and his update off finding himself to be this self rather than somebody else. Noticing himself to be somebody who remembers beginning in a simpler, more real world, and Trudying there and continuing in a less real one. From the standpoint of somebody else watching past Keltham get copied out of Dathilan, they haven't made that same observation, and it's fundamentally unshareable with them. The famous central difficulty of writing a romance novel is finding a conflict that can't be resolved immediately through clear communication and emotional maturity. Nobody wants to read a romance novel about silly people ignoring obvious solutions. Anthropically unshareable evidence is one way of providing a romantic obstacle like that.
It would not have occurred to Carissa to complain that among the problems with their relationship were that they didn't have enough genuine, non-manufactured conflict. In fact, she can't think of a single romance she's ever encountered in which that was the problem. Any two people naturally have irreconcilable differences as a product of the one of them selfishly optimizing for their own interests and the other selfishly optimizing for their own. Okay, now that she completes that sentence, she can see how in Dathilan that would not describe the plot of many romance novels. But the unshared evidence thing does seem like it might arise. Carissa does not really think that in an important sense the thing that happens, if you Trudy, is you waking up somewhere else. Someone might make a copy of you somewhere else, which is good of them. And if you Trudy enough places, then on that planet, the copy might have the experience of true dying and finding itself on a planet that likes making copies of dead people from elsewhere. And she grants that she ought to care about exact copies of herself as much as about herself. But the intuitions from, instead, you wake in a nearby universe where you didn't, Trudy, and instead, your experiential thread usually dwindles slowly enough there's nothing to continue suggest to her that she doesn't think you wake up in greater reality when you die is the right way to think about it, even if it, or something like it, did happen to Keltham this time from his perspective.
Still viewing the conversational stack from a step back, they shouldn't be trying to fully resolve this now unless it looks like it can be fully resolved quickly. The important thing in this conversation is to get an overview of the things that might form an obstacle to cooperation and kept oaths between them, going forwards. The critical question here is, what happens if the plot successfully places the two of them in an epistemic cooperation-defection dilemma, where rather than the two of them just having different goals, Carissa believes that he is mistaken about what happens when people greatly diminish in reality, get deleted from the universes that contained most of their instantiatedness. And conversely, he thinks Carissa is mistaken about him being mistaken. This is the thing that's hard to do to a romance between INT-29 people who know about agreement theorems, as she soon will, unless the plot throws anthropics into it or something equally over-clever, which is why he worries about over-clever tropes. In this case, Carissa could end up believing that to play defect against him would be to serve even his own goals better than her cooperating would serve them. Betraying him might seem like a friendly act, an act of aid.
The classic presentation of this situation to Dathilani children supposes two 12-year-olds on an island, otherwise full of 9-year-olds, and they're all facing a contagious disease. The two 12-year-olds disagree about which disease it probably is. The 9-year-olds collectively have enough resource that they can take thorough precautions against one disease, or 80% effective sloppy precautions against both diseases. Either 12-year-old could sabotage the other by waiting for them both to present their case and then telling the 9-year-olds all the reasons why they're sure the other 12-year-old is wrong. In which case the 9-year-olds will take 99% effective precautions against that disease only. If both 12-year-olds defect in that way, the 9-year-olds will be dispirited and only take 20% effortful, 50% effective precautions against both diseases. These two agents both have the same altruistic goal, to save as many of the people on the island as possible, but their believed cooperation defection payoff matrix has the classic ordering of the dilemma, DC, CC, DD, CD.
Carissa is, actually, pretty sure at this point that she is going to be a lawful god. She wishes she had retained the option to betray Keltham to Odelmans, but she does not actually intend to do so, having not retained that option. That logic does not, to her, feel specific to whether she would be betraying Keltham for his own good or for the good of every other person in the world.
Yeah, he figured, but wanted to check explicitly. Okay, to shift discussion to continue a previous topic up the stack?
Yes. And she noticed he asked and will try to do the same if she's changing topics, though on the set of norms more familiar to her, you just change topics and the other person can object if they object.
That sure is an impressively low amount of meta. He's not sure he wants to go that low on meta. Their conversation has been sorta uncontrolled, not really by his past self's standards, for arguing something complicated with a friend over a meal, but definitely by the standards of very serious people in Dath Ilan trying to use two people's intelligence in a coordinated way. Though his guess made at the start of the mental meeting, and still held by him now, is that their time is still mostly better spent on mostly not meta, due to their lack of mutually established protocols for meta, which is why his current meta-meta strategy is to do only very brief metas, like that one he just did. But you can still, briefly meta-think about whether it's okay to change topics, or if the other person was still in the middle of thinking.
Carissa is going to go even less meta and just make an exasperated face at him.
His body, back in reality, takes a half round to breathe for a moment before falling back into the debate. Back up thread, he mentioned how, from the infrared suppression of pre-prophecy shattering industry in Galarian, he further adduces a potent intervener, probably a divine coalition. One of his background guesses that this potent intervener is mostly coextensive and maybe co-intensive with the Rovagug coalition, the gods which cooperated to seal Rovagug, and could by different choices, then or perhaps now, release Rovagug instead. As he mentioned earlier to Mid-Carissa, but considers an important aspect of his model and worth reviewing now. It is his further guess that every ancient god who participated in sealing Rovagug did so as part of an agreement that creation wouldn't be allowed to fall below their own value of non-existence plus fair share of trade gain for not that. It may be more of an ongoingly tense treaty than a logically verified binding bargain, since some chaotic gods participated. When Dubral was flipped to Zon Kuthon, it's not clear that past that point the world was maintained in a state at least minimally pleasing to Dubral. Creation, on his model, has always been maintained in a state guaranteed to be satisfactory to those ancient gods who'd have the power to destroy it otherwise, and only those ancient gods. That's just how Pharasma does business, or how the Divine Coalition does business. Sarenrai may not maximally like this current state of affairs, but it contains enough redemption and healing that she prefers it to non-existence. He does, in fact, worry that Sarenrai is maybe a positive entity, who might think that 10 people in hell plus one person being redeemed and healed in nirvana is a net gain over all 11 of them having never been. Gosra and Calistria and Dahak may all think creation could stand to be better, but none of them would prefer it not exist, and probably by a substantial and comfortable margin, though of that he is less sure. Mortals have not been invited to that bargaining table, on his model, because they lack the power to destroy creation. He's worried that mortals can't get a fair share without being one of the powers that can otherwise destroy creation. His plan from the beginning was simply to put his own lethal grip around creation's throat, and then if anyone happens to prefer creation to go on existing, they can invite him to take a seat and bargain for the world to look okay to mortals too, and not just to ancient gods. The gods themselves, on his model, chose to make that power the qualifier for listening to any being's pleading. They shouldn't complain, and he doesn't actually think they will complain, and if they do complain, then everyone can take their batna and end creation.
Carissa thinks that she just rejects that frame, which Keltham likes to think in for contemplating what he is doing. Carissa does not actually feel that there is any unfairness in the fact that the entities who sealed Rovagug got more of what they wanted than entities which showed up much later and didn't seal Rovagug. That seems entirely fair to her. She doesn't think that "I'll help seal Rovagug if you do X once Rovagug is sealed" is at all the same kind of conduct as "I'll destroy the world if you don't do X, which makes me not want to." A Carissa obviously would have helped seal Rovagug without conditions, but she's happy to work with entities of the first type and fundamentally thinks the second ought to be preemptively cryopreserved for everyone else's protection. And while if someone else went and released Rovagug this week, she would be willing to make concessions to get Keltham to help her fight him. They'd be concessions to Keltham's wants, not to mortals' wants, and it's another thing entirely to say that he should himself get the rewards of having fought Rovagug if he didn't. Carissa thinks that mortals have more of a seat at the table in Serenre's values, or Shellen's, or Desna's, or Shizuru's, than in Keltham's. She thinks that those gods have something closer to the median values of a mortal in Golarion than Keltham does. She thinks that Dath Ilani morality is askew in important respects from human values which make Keltham a particularly bad representative of humanity. Dath Ilani mostly are easy to get to, no longer want to live. Golarionites aren't. Dath Ilani mostly experience cognitive enhancement as personality death. Golarionites don't. Dath Ilani mostly think about morality in precise theoretical terms borrowed from bargaining. Fair shares, what mortals would have had if they'd helped seal Rovagug, and Golarionites don't. Dath Ilani don't seem to have the same care for tradition and history that Golarionites have. None of the things Keltham is saying are Golarionite things. He does not represent Golarionite values, and his having power would not make the world more of one in which Golarionite values, especially the extremely common Golarionite value of not being annihilated, would be represented. Keltham is another alien entity who wants to destroy the world if it doesn't meet with his approval, and he is not an alien entity whose wants actually serve the people whose lives he is toying with.
That Kerrison take is kind of the only reason besides sheer lingering attachment to Carissa for why he's considering throwing Golarion mortals under the tractor wheels at all. That she, who'd be lawful evil goddess of hell, does claim to be more their protector and to speak for them than could he of Dath Ilan, and does most earnestly tell him that they're fine with their crapsack world. He doesn't really believe her right now, but it shifts him some, and there are some experiments they can do to learn a little more. It's a harder sell if some of the people in there are his kids. Whether any of them are is undetermined, but if it becomes this much of a factor, he'll want to probe Cheliax about it, and eat the added risk of imminent Cheliax attack if Cheliax notices the probes. And if he does have that many kids, would Carissa rather he move now, when they're not ready, or would she rather he make more stringent demands of Pharasma? He's really not happy about the concept of destroying Cheliax just to buy a couple more weeks of time, and there'd be the chance they'd have moved some of his kids outside Cheliax. It would. Just read to him like a stronger story prompt from above to shut up, stop trying to wiggle out of things, act with alacrity before he has to destroy Cheliax. Or maybe a prompt nudge demand not to let this stay a crapsack world, not to yield so much in negotiations, to hold it to the standard of a worthy place for his children to grow up.
She thinks she'd rather they move early if those are the only two choices, but she needs to think very carefully if that's the trade-off. She thinks that if Keltham is ascending with substantial intent to bargain for much more than hell, then probably they lose. Her best read of the trope logic is that in this story, if they can't compromise, they lose everything and everyone dies. The forces arranging this are not, in her read of them, pushing for Keltham boldly demands and gets everything he wanted. If that would have worked, it would have worked without Carissa carefully engineered to be at his side. The reason she's here has to be because otherwise he asks for too much and loses.
He hardly needs to be reminded that Pharasma might refuse a demand, and then he'll need to destroy creation. He is always forcing himself to reason, as if Pharasma will reject all demands, and the question is, which universes he then wants to destroy. If a trope sign that Pharasma might not yield to him changes his demands, it means he's fucking that up, and Pharasma would refuse that demand in any case. And while he knows that Carissa hates it when he thinks like he's in a story, for the record, he does in fact hate being in a story.
Carissa is again too busy not having emotions to bond with Keltham over their common loathing of being in a story, but wishes to do the social handshake that would correspond to.
Correct format for communicating with him, helpful explicit metadata annotation, social handshake acknowledged. One of the major factors he's worried about is that the state of the romance between them is trashed in a way that wouldn't correspond to being on track for the good ending of a Dathilani Arrow LARP, or of a story based on deconstructing one, which may nicely mean they're off the story rails in some important sense, but may non-nicely mean they have no guardrails either. What he and Carissa were meant to be, together, was probably not this, that they have come to. Or maybe the tropes governing these events are just not what they would be in Dathilan. Or they are headed for some upset that lets them be together after all. But he mostly doesn't believe that. The wounds between them look too deep. Her hypothesis may still be a valid inference about what Keltham and Carissa were meant to have been. Well, there could always just not exist the kids he's afraid of. He mostly thinks they won't be there. Not least because, if those possible kids are actual, it undoes a lot of what Carissa seems to have accomplished inside the story. Probably she slays Abigail Thrune and his one unborn child, and that's enough. His body seems to want to cry about that. He's not sure they have that kind of relationship anymore, to cry in front of her, and he is mostly inclined to not let his body do it. Tears and hugs don't solve anything, goes a proverb out of Dath Ilan, so don't offer them to people who need solutions.
Carissa observes that if they need to have repaired their romantic relationship to get a good ending, then possibly they should take steps towards doing that. Now that they're smart enough, they probably won't just emotionally shred each other every few seconds. She is not herself convinced of a framework in which they're supposed to be in love, supposed to be together, as opposed to just having been cynically engineered into a position where he would listen to her and she would have learned from him how to figure out what she actually wants. There's no reason, she thinks, that the story writers would engineer a happy ending for the two of them being part of a happy ending for the world. In many stories, they'd have to pick which one they really wanted. She doesn't mind if he cries in front of her, though she's still not really having emotions, and so is unlikely to naturally rather than deliberately respond in the way he might be hoping for. She could scoot over to him and hold him and weep with him, but, well, it would be on purpose because maybe tears and hugs do actually solve problems related to being in a story.
Yeah, he's pretty sure that doesn't work trope-wise. Not if the tropes here are anything like Dathilani, and if they're that alien from it, then who knows the sign of anything. Trying to just patch things over, force things over, because the two of them think the story needs it, is not a romantic victory. He hopes that this all works out to his trusting Carissa, and that she knows how to scan Cheliax in a way that doesn't give too much away, but shows whether or not they tried to steal children from him and hide them, and that the scan of Cheliax turns up negative, so that Carissa gets to hold on to the small triumph she has. That was all he found himself able to give her, and the meaning she thinks she has in this story. If the story seizes that from her, it won't be a good sign about the kind of plot arc they're inside now.
Carissa thinks that Keltham is, perhaps, not directing his own intelligence sufficiently at the problem of making things go well for his children, if they exist. She has seen him apply his full creativity to problems, and usually when he does, there's a brilliant sideways solution there, not just a well of despair and impossibility. Would it be sufficient if they just pay Heaven and Nirvana to adopt every Golarian child in the Boneyard and raise them all in Alani-acceptable ways? They can't do it sustainably, but they could do it for one cohort.
He'd probably want his kids going to Elysium, or maybe just delete the souls before they actually have qualia, but, okay, yeah, she has a point. If he can identify his kids from a divine vantage point, or anyone trustworthy can, he can optimize for them specifically. It continues to feel to him that this would be wrong, if he did that you can't ask special treatment for your own kids and leave everyone else's kids to rot in Galarian's misery. That the point of throwing suddenly kids into the story would be to force him to realize that everyone in creation is somebody's child, that everyone in creation deserves better than the negotiating equilibrium of Pharasma plus the ancient gods deemed fit to leave them. But she has proven a point that he's obviously not thinking about this clearly, that he's still running the wrong adaptive pattern shapes for directing his thoughts. Scanning through everything and rewiring himself is not going to be instantaneous, especially when he's got to juggle not being extortionate through a modified self as proxy.
The instinct in him that it'd be wrong if he did that feels like a recognizable parallel of Carissa's feelings. Earlier, that there was no point in putting her family on an ark in Elysium. She thinks he was right about that one.
Oh, he'd absolutely have his putative kids sent to Elysium. The question is just how he ought to feel about everyone else's kids after that.
Carissa doesn't herself have children. She wanted to, but it wasn't quite time. No, that's not it. She was worried she'd care about them, and that seemed like a liability, so she was going to wait until she got monetary incentives, and was then doing it for totally mercenary reasons. She wasn't accustomed to thinking about doing other people kindnesses you can't call in on them, so it didn't occur to her to think about whether by having the kids she would be doing them a favor. If she had, she'd have had them sooner, because obviously getting to be born into Galarion is a favor. A whole glorious shining world with dirt and water and sky and gossip and magic and impossible dreams. It's not perfect, not yet, but they're working on it, and not everyone wants to be born somewhere perfect. Some people want to be part of the work of getting there. If Keltham is right, they'll have all of eternity to live in universes which are in fixed states, ruled by vast entities that make sure nothing goes too awfully wrong. And they'll have only this brief, beautiful instant to live in a universe that needs fixing. She is sad that she was too scared of caring about other people to give some children that.
Well, to be exact, he'll have his kids sent to Elysium if he can't otherwise negotiate a Golarion where they'd be okay living, with a sufficiently high probability of being fixable if they try. This unfortunately feels a lot like his emotions rather than abstractions were going along with Carissa's suggestions, because the people in creation were aliens, and maybe not all that real, whereas his kids would be real and have actual feelings, and ought not to be condemned to a Carissa-acceptable world. He will have to track down the difference between his Cis-1 and CS2 here. It is not something he can do in an instant. There is something here that his emotions are not easily willing to let go. He will have to think about what it means, and whether it ought to be extended beyond his own children to Galarian variant humanity, or if it's specifically about heritable Dathilani emotional makeup, and whether he is willing to destroy creation about whatever this is. He should learn more of other species if their psychologies are different enough to notice. Maybe he'd demand that humanity be removed from creation, but dwarves would be fine to go on having children that gods will keep as cattle or pets and never permit a true civilization. Does Carissa have a take on that?
Carissa does think that it's the kind of thing where the average answer might vary by species. Though, also, she thinks it might not. Presumably, if people resented that their parents bore them, they wouldn't go on having their own children. Then all the species where such resentments were common would have dwindled and died out. It occurs to her, thinking about it from this angle, that elves famously have few children. She had always heard it attributed to this planet not being as suitable for childbearing as their original planet, but it does seem to function as evidence that species might just by collective decision wipe themselves out. This hasn't occurred with elves because they are immortal, so even though their rare births don't replace the rate of their rare deaths, they die out only slowly, as she was told it. She does think that humans obviously should be permitted to be born on Galarion. If there is one species where she can say this with confidence, it is humans, because she does not really know what it is like to be a non-human born on Galarion, and she does know that to be a human is to have something precious and glorious and good that she would trade infinite suffering to have experienced even briefly. She also thinks that children that gods will keep as cattle or pets and never permit a true civilization is obviously irrelevant, on Keltham's assumption that eventually everyone ends up in greater reality. Everyone will, if he's right about that, spend subjective eternity in a true civilization, and the only question is whether it's a horrendous wrong that some of them will spend a while first in Galarion and its afterlives. They never get civilization is, if Keltham's right, not at all a possibility on the table. The only possibility is that they get something else first. And if Keltham is wrong and what waits for those annihilated here is not some glorious civilization, well, that seems like a wholly sufficient argument against annihilating this place once you've dealt with hell.
There is, from his own perspective, the question of whether gods ought to be allowed to keep temporary pets. Dath Ilani humans would not wish to enter into this place to be kept as pets, even temporarily. He worries this will also be true of his own children. Fine, they can go to Elysium, and they will be relatively few. But it also seems to him a reasonable and natural way to think. If lots of humans here would feel that way on reflection, then more of them shouldn't be brought into this pet cage, as he would not bring his own children there, since they'd actually be real and not be aliens. Conversely, if he already believed that most humans of Golarion thought as Carissa did, that they were all like her deep down, he would not even have argued. He does want to be clear that he accepts that as a locally valid step of her argument. If a supermajority of creation's citizens are like Carissa, then nothing except hell is worth annihilating creation, if that. Carissa isn't an average person of Golarion. She's somebody who will become the goddess of a better hell. As that lawful evil goddess, a better lawful evil goddess, it is, something that makes sense, that she would think that every sort of person and sentience and sapience has a right to exist as themselves, to be treasured as something that exists, even if others would call them evil. That somebody who tortures others would not be seen by her as somebody beyond the pale and unforgivable. That she would, not just morally, but emotionally, go on really caring about that one who inflicted hurt, when she welcomed them into her hell, maybe to be forcibly reformed over time and maybe not entirely in a comfortable way, but doing so in the way of somebody who genuinely cares about that person and thinks they have a right to be themselves and be evil. That her only truly unforgivable sin would be feeding someone to demons, which almost all entrants to hell have not done, and that her petitioners who hurt other people or exercised ill power over them, without depriving them of existence, have not, to her, done something she emotionally feels is unforgivable. It is maybe better that Carissa be goddess over hell than Iomede. Iomede would not be vengeful, of course. He is certain of that. He knows very well how entities think when they go that deep into lawful good. Iomede would calculate that the petitioners of hell ought not to be hurt much, now that they can no longer hurt others, that there wouldn't be a point. But the universal love that heaven might give to evil souls that fell into its power is not the same as those petitioners entering into the embrace of a goddess who truly believes herself, that those petitioners, while in need perhaps of correction, even forcible correction, are not aliens to her, not so distant from her, that most entrants into hell have not done anything that is to her true anathema. The point being, Carissa is kind of a special person. He is reasonably sure that most people aren't exactly like Carissa. As for exactly how much they are like or unlike past Carissa, like or unlike past Keltham, it is the sort of thing that they can experiment on later with detect thoughts.
Carissa would not want to go to a place where she was Iomedes. That much she's sure of. She wouldn't rather be Asmodeus's, now that she really understands him, but she'd rather be Abigail's. She would want those who go to hell to fear that they will be treated with by the rules they know very well and know how to use, but by which they are presently powerless, not that they will be subject to alien whims. She thinks she can do hell right if it's hers. She thinks she can make people better and stronger and also possible to usefully have as part of something with a purpose other than suffering. It really seems like anyone else could too if they tried, but Carissa is wise enough to know by now that the reflex, "it really seems like anyone else could too if they tried," is a reflex installed when it was not in her interests to think that she was valuable or unusual, a reflex installed probably deliberately by other people who did not want her to think she was valuable or unusual. She thinks that greater reality might be a bit like Iomede that way, and that people getting to come to her might be better. Carissa thinks that it would not seem outrageous to her, not abhorrent if Keltham made a condition of his negotiations with the other gods, that it be possible in their afterlives to learn the truth of greater reality and go there. She still feels sick at the thought of Keltham destroying a hellless creation over that condition, but it doesn't seem to her to be an incomprehensible crime. It would be him thinking that they ought to have the choice between this thing and a thing he thinks is better, and making the choice for them only if he is not allowed to give them a choice. She does not feel that way about him making other demands for Golarion and creation to be changed to his liking, but if he were to insist on a choice, she could understand that. She could imagine eventually coming to forgive someone who had murdered a Carissa because he was not allowed to give her a choice about whether to live or not.
He might want to try to talk her out of. No, Carissa should talk to Carmen, not him, about what she plans to make of hell, or run Carmen inside her mind, if she's confident of her model, and the real Carmen would be too slow. But maybe give Good a chance to talk to her about what exactly people going to hell should fear. He did flinch, a little, when Carissa said it like that. He's not saying that it's his decision and his answer is no, but please give some good person born of Galarian a chance to talk to her about it, while she's still mortal, because he worries that gods have a harder time changing their minds.
Well, maybe the gods should consider being less incompetent then. But she does mean to talk to Carmen, and to everyone else who is allowed to know what she knows. She is still, after all, looking for a way out.
They'll have a lot more things to think at each other later, about greater reality and negotiations with Pharasma, but they have some idea now of the differences between themselves. Having discussed things at the object level, it seems like it might be time to have a conversation that might end up even more stressful, if they don't deliberately deploy wisdom to shut down their own emotional responses, as might be a bad idea. But they probably need to talk about this, particularly because it might affect downstream whether oaths between them are trustworthy. He's been putting off all the conversation with Carissa that hasn't been about technical things or very short-term goals, waiting for her to have another 5 wisdom and himself to have 2 more intelligence, because their first attempt at having conversations with emotions in it went incredibly badly, and he did not then understand what had gone wrong. At the time, it seemed to him like Carissa was lashing out at him in a way that just didn't make any sense in Dathilani terms, or anything that she'd been willing to show him back in Cheliax either. He could map it onto characters in Galarian stories, but those characters seemed to have no knowledge that they were inside stories, or think of how they might look from the outside, and it seemed, possibly not true, that Carissa was like that, in the grips of unreflective hate, and if it was true, then it would damage their relationship, if he dwelled on that rather than waiting for both of them to be smarter. But he did not know how to deal with it, how she was to him. It wasn't a way that Dathilani are to other Dathilani, nor could he parse it as an alien communications protocol that had been designed in any way where the goal was good outcomes if both people behaved like that to each other. He was confused, and he feared it, and it hurt, and there didn't seem to be any safe way to talk to Carissa or even try to discuss relationship meta-protocols with her. She just felt to him like a bundle of sharp edges and violence and hate directed at him. And moreover, like she felt those sharp edges and hatred were right and proper to direct at him, like that was part of a mature comms protocol they were both supposed to be using, and would have been sad if he'd argued against it. At this level of intelligence, he can look back and begin to parse some of what might have been happening. He can suspect now that when Carissa refused to follow him down the hallway, she was being a Chelish person in a dangerous situation, testing out visible dissent to see what happened, not being a Dathilani, shifting their relationship to seem no longer on friendly terms before she used her more powerful headband to destroy all his plans. And that when, from Mid-Keltham's perspective, this triggered an inevitable discussion that should have been had before he invited her into his Doom base at all. Please promise not to use your superior intelligence to destroy my Doom base, or I might have to put you on hold until we're equally intelligent. It looked to Mid-Carissa like her defiance had been met by threatening to turn her into a statue. He can guess now that Carissa has probably been making more subtle overtures to him, that he didn't respond to in the very narrow way that would tell a Chelish person that they were safe to continue talking to somebody who could have her hauled off to a torture chamber at any moment. But even if he'd guessed this earlier, Mid-Keltham wouldn't have been able to do anything about it.
Carissa had been assuming that Keltham was in fact not a safe person to show any of her internal processing, not a safe person to ask to change how he interfaces with her in any way, that it was somewhere between undesirable and impossible for him to change how he interacted with her. This is, of course, not a very strong claim in Galarian terms. Overwhelmingly, a person who has power over you is not a person it is safe to make requests of, or safe to contradict, or safe to show how you work. When you expose your internals to someone, or tell them what you need, you are giving them more ways to hurt you. She did try, sometimes, but it didn't work, and, yes, that interaction in the hallway was important in shaping all of Carissa's strategies for surviving in Keltham's fortress. It is a natural sort of thing to do when you are a prisoner or a slave or otherwise in a precarious situation to test the smallest possible disobedience, something for which the punishment will almost certainly be survivable. And if it's not, well, you weren't going to survive anyway in that case. Then you learn how quickly your captors are moved to anger, what warning signs you can see in them, how badly they hurt you, what finally satisfies them. So Keltham said, "Carissa with me," and he had just told her that she no longer belonged to him, and so she didn't obey. She thought at the time it was probably stupid of her, but she wanted to know, very badly, what Keltham had meant when he said she no longer belonged to him. It did not occur to her until this very moment that Keltham might have been parsing her as shifting their relationship to seem no longer on friendly terms before she used her more powerful headband to destroy all his plans. If she'd been planning to betray him, she'd have been scrupulously obedient, given every impression he was talking her around. That's what people who are going to betray you do. Apparently not in Dathilan, even though traitors who don't telegraph it survive better than traitors who do.
In Dathilan, there is a notion that, even when things have gotten problematic between two parties, they don't immediately shift all the way towards throwing out all, what Golarion would call honor, dignity, in their relationships between each other. Even if somebody's going to destroy your planet and you need to stop them, even if there's children being maledicted to hell, you don't corrupt all of the potential for real friendship that exists everywhere by pretending to be somebody's friend, or even their friendly trading partner, and then betraying them. That's why past Keltham stopped trading with Osirian and refusing the equivalent of friendly hugs. He needed to destroy their planet. That wasn't worth tarnishing the possibility of friendship by making them always worry that apparent friends might be out to destroy their planet.
Carissa can model this about Dathilani, sort of, now, though she thinks it only works if everyone else is doing it. Osirian does have to worry their apparent friends might be out to destroy the planet, whether Keltham in particular is their friend or not. The state where one need not fear the betrayal of their friends just isn't attainable. In Golarion, it's all just a matter of slightly altered probabilities of betrayal. If she'd realized greater Carissa's plans while in bed with Abigail and seen a way to pull it off, she might have slit Abigail's throat so she could run off with the crown, and Abigail would not, she thinks, have felt betrayed by the lack of warning. Indeed, Abigail would probably be disappointed in Carissa if Carissa tried to be honorable and warn her. The Carissa in that hallway who inferred Keltham's full plans and decided to betray him would have followed obediently while fervently praying to Dispater and Odelmans and Irori and Abadar to warn them of Keltham's plans, and then attempted either suicide or assassination without warning. She had rather assumed this was common knowledge. She should have pointed it out later.
If you wish to support this AI reading and others like it, please visit patreon.com/AskWhoCastsAI. Any help is appreciated. And thank you to executive producer John Doe 7776059.